I still remember the moment I said it. The words left my lips so effortlessly, so carelessly, that I almost didn't register their weight. I had no idea that those few syllables would unravel everything I had built, everything I thought I knew. But now, as I sit here in the suffocating silence of our bedroom, staring at the neatly folded sheets on his side of the bed, I realize, I had been playing with fire for far too long. It was supposed to be a joke, just an offhand remark. We were in the garage, the scent of oil and old wood surrounding us as Mason carefully polished the deep, rich wood of his new bass guitar. It was a thing of beauty, sleek and resonant, the kind of instrument that commanded attention. He had saved up for months, researching every model, every wood grain, every subtlety of sound until he finally settled on this one. The pride in his eyes was undeniable as he ran his fingers over the strings, lost in the quiet hum of satisfaction. I should have smiled. I should have told him it was perfect. But instead, I let the words slip. Your bass is so much better than mine. A simple sentence. But one that meant everything. Because I didn't own a bass. I never had. For a moment, there was silence, just the faint buzz of a single plucked string reverberating through the air. Then Mason turned to look at me, his brow furrowing just slightly. What? I laughed, too quickly. I mean, if I had one. I reached for his hand, trying to brush it off, trying to erase the moment before it settled into his bones. But he didn't laugh. He didn't even smile. Mason wasn't a jealous man. He wasn't the type to question, to pry, to assume the worst. But something flickered behind his eyes then, something dark and uncertain, and I knew, that I had just made the biggest mistake of my life. Because there was another bass. One I had traced my fingers over in a dimly lit apartment. One that had hummed beneath someone else's hands as I laid beside them, the resonance vibrating through the sheets, through my skin. One that belonged to a man who was not my husband. Mason didn't ask any more questions that night. He simply finished polishing his guitar, placed it carefully on its stand, and kissed me on the forehead before heading to bed. But the silence between us was no longer the comfortable quiet we once shared. It was charged, heavy, waiting for the inevitable storm. And now, as I sit here in the dark, heart hammering against my ribs, I wonder, how much does he know? How much does he suspect? And when the truth finally comes out, will there be anything left to save? I clutched the sheets tighter, forcing myself to breathe. Because one thing is certain. Mason isn't the kind of man who lets things slide. The next morning, Mason was already gone before I woke up. That wasn't unusual, he had early shifts sometimes, but there was something unsettling about the silence he left behind. Normally, there'd be a note, a quick text, something. But today? Nothing. I reached for my phone, hesitating before unlocking it. A gnawing fear crawled up my spine as I scrolled through my messages, half expecting to see something from him. Instead, my heart nearly stopped at the sight of a name I had no business seeing on my screen. Ethan, we need to talk. Now. I dropped the phone as if it had burned me. The room felt smaller, closing in around me as my own pulse throbbed in my ears. No. Not now. Not today. Not when Mason might already be suspicious. I took a shaky breath, forcing myself to pick up the phone and type a reply. Not now. I can't. 3 dots appeared almost immediately. Then they vanished. Then they reappeared. My stomach twisted into knots as I waited for his response. Ethan, he knows, doesn't he? I felt my blood turn to ice. I didn't have an answer, not one that would fix any of this. I had played a dangerous game, convinced myself I could keep my life in neat, separate compartments. But Mason wasn't stupid. He noticed things. And last night, I had given him a reason to start putting the pieces together. A car door slammed outside. I nearly jumped out of my skin, rushing to the window. Mason's truck was in the driveway. He was home, hours earlier than expected. I barely had time to shove my phone into my pocket before the front door creaked open. He stepped inside, his expression unreadable, eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that sent my stomach plummeting. "I took the day off," he said simply, closing the door behind him. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. "Why?" Mason didn't answer right away. He walked into the kitchen, setting his keys down with deliberate slowness before turning to face me again. "Because I think we need to talk." And just like that, my carefully built house of lies began to collapse. Mason's words hung in the air, thick and suffocating. My heart pounded against my ribs as I struggled to maintain composure. This was it, the moment I had dreaded since the second those careless words had slipped from my mouth. I forced a smile, desperate to keep the ground beneath me from crumbling. "Talk? About what?" Mason's jaw clenched. "You tell me." His voice was steady, but I could hear the undercurrent of something dangerous, something raw. The weight of his stare pinned me in place, and I knew, without a doubt, that he had more than just suspicions. I swallowed hard. "Mason, you're scaring me." "Good." He stepped closer, his eyes scanning my face, searching for something, maybe guilt, maybe an explanation that could make sense of the gnawing doubt I had planted in his mind. "Tell me, Hannah. Who owns the other base?" My breath hitched. The room seemed to tilt. It was such a simple question, but it carried the force of a wrecking ball. My mind raced, scrambling for a way out. A plausible lie. A half-truth. Anything. But Mason didn't give me time to answer. "Because I know it's not yours," he continued, his voice quiet but sharp enough to cut through every feeble excuse forming in my head. "And I know you weren't joking last night." My mouth opened, but nothing came out. He knew. Maybe not everything, not yet, but enough to know there was someone else. Someone whose presence lingered in the unspoken spaces between us. And then, before I could summon any kind of defense, Mason reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. The screen glowed as he tapped something, then turned it toward me. A message thread. A name. Ethan. A message I had never seen before stared back at me. "Mason, who the hell are you?" My stomach dropped. Ethan had replied. I felt the blood drain from my face as I stared at the screen. Mason's message to Ethan was simple, but its implications were catastrophic. I forced myself to breathe, to think, but my thoughts were in chaos, tangling into a knot I couldn't unravel. Mason's eyes stayed locked on mine, burning with quiet fury. "He responded," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Want to see what he said?" I shook my head instinctively, my body recoiling from the truth that was about to hit me like a freight train. But Mason wasn't going to let me escape. He tapped the screen, scrolling down to reveal Ethan's reply. "Ethan, I guess she didn't tell you everything, huh?" A cold wave of nausea swept over me. The words were a dagger, their weight far heavier than I was prepared for. Mason watched my reaction, his jaw tightening with every second of my silence. "Tell me, Hannah," he said, his voice trembling with restraint. "Tell me what he meant. What didn't you tell me?" I opened my mouth, but my throat was too dry, too tight to let anything out. I could see the calculations in Mason's eyes, the gears turning as he pieced together the puzzle I had tried so desperately to keep hidden. I didn't know how much Ethan had told him, how much Mason had figured out on his own, but it was enough. Enough to change everything. I need the truth. Now. Mason's hands were clenched into fists, his knuckles white. Was it just once? Or has it been happening this whole time? Tears burned in my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. "Mason, His phone buzzed again. A new message. "Ethan, I can come over if you want to talk." Mason inhaled sharply, his nostrils flaring as he gritted his teeth. "Oh, we're going to talk," he muttered, shoving his phone into his pocket. Then his eyes snapped back to me, and for the first time since this started, I saw it, the raw, unfiltered devastation beneath his rage. But first, you're going to tell me exactly who he is to you. Before I could respond, the front door creaked open. My sister, Claire, stepped inside, her eyes darting between us. She had stopped by unannounced, a habit of hers, but the tension in the room must have been palpable because her face twisted in immediate concern. "What's going on?" she asked hesitantly, setting her purse on the counter. Mason let out a bitter chuckle, shaking his head. "Oh, you're just in time for the show, Claire. Seems your sister's got secrets she didn't want me to know." Claire's brows knit together, and then her gaze landed on me. "Hannah, what is he talking about?" Before I could find the words, the doorbell rang. The air thickened. My stomach flipped, and Mason's lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile, more like the shadow of one, dark and cruel. "That would be Ethan," Mason said coldly. "Since he's so eager to talk." The room felt impossibly small as I stood frozen between my past and my present, between a choice I had made and a reckoning I could no longer avoid. Claire's hand gently touched my arm, grounding me, but nothing could stop the inevitable. Mason turned and strode to the door, his movements deliberate, the weight of his fury pressing against my chest. He pulled it open, and there stood Ethan, his expression unreadable. For a moment, no one spoke. The three of us locked in a silent battlefield, waiting for the first shot to be fired. Mason was about to find out just how deep the betrayal ran. And so was everyone else. Ethan stood in the doorway, his gaze shifting between Mason and me, tension crackling in the air like a live wire. He hadn't expected this. Neither had I. But Mason had orchestrated this moment, and there was no running from it now. Mason's grip on the doorknob tightened, his knuckles white. "Come in," he said, his voice eerily calm. Too calm. The kind of calm that hid a storm underneath. Ethan hesitated for only a second before stepping inside. The door closed behind him with a heavy finality. Claire shifted uncomfortably, sensing the weight of what was about to unfold. "Maybe I should go," she murmured, glancing at me, but Mason shook his head. "No," he said, eyes locked onto Ethan. "Stay. Since you're already here, you might as well hear it all." Ethan cleared his throat, his expression hardening. "Mason, I don't think this is the way." "Don't," Mason interrupted, holding up a hand. "I don't want to hear your excuses. I want to hear it from her." My breath caught in my throat. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might break through my ribs. Mason was giving me one last chance, to tell the truth, to lay everything bare. But what could I say? That I had betrayed him over and over? That every time I had touched Ethan, I had known it was wrong and done it anyway? Claire's hand squeezed my arm. I turned to her, my vision blurring. She wasn't angry, just sad. Disappointed. "Hannah." Mason took a step forward, towering over Ethan. "How long?" I exhaled shakily, gripping the edge of the kitchen counter for support. "Mason, How long?" he barked, voice rising like a crack of thunder. Ethan sighed, rubbing a hand down his face. "Over a year." Mason laughed, but it was devoid of any real humor. A bitter, hollow sound. He turned his eyes back to me, and I wished he would just yell, just explode, anything but look at me like that, with devastation, with something close to hatred. "A year," he repeated, his voice hollow. "A year of lies. A year of pretending. A year of making me look like a damn fool." I opened my mouth to speak, to apologize, but Mason didn't give me the chance. His body tensed, his fists clenched, and for a terrifying moment, I thought he might hit Ethan. Instead, he took a sharp breath and stepped back. "Get out," Mason said, his voice quieter now but carrying even more weight. "Both of you. Get out of my house." I felt the floor give way beneath me. "Mason, please." I said get out, he roared, his face twisted with anguish. Ethan grabbed my wrist, pulling me toward the door. Claire stayed behind, eyes locked onto Mason as if she were afraid he might shatter completely the moment I left. As the door slammed behind us, the weight of my choices crushed me. I had lost everything in the span of a single moment. And now, all I could do was watch my world burn. The cold night air slapped me as I stumbled onto the porch, my mind reeling. Ethan's grip on my wrist was firm, but I yanked my hand away, needing space to breathe, to think. My heart pounded in my ears, drowning out everything else. "Hannah, we need to go," Ethan urged, but I barely heard him. My eyes were locked on the front door, now closed, now separating me from Mason. The weight of what I had done, what I had lost, crushed me. I could barely stand. Claire emerged behind us, her arms wrapped tightly around herself as if she were shielding herself from the disaster unfolding before her. "What the hell did you expect, Hannah?" she hissed, her voice low and sharp. "Did you think he'd just forgive you? Let you stay?" I shook my head. No, she cut me off. "Don't. Just don't. You've hurt him enough. Leave." The finality of her words sent a sharp pain through me. I turned to Ethan, whose expression was unreadable, but his patience was thinning. "We can't stay here," he said. "Come on, Hannah." I wanted to fight, to argue, to break down and scream, but I had no right. So I let him lead me away from the house, my feet numb as we moved toward his car. Every step felt like another nail sealing the coffin of the life I had just destroyed. Mason's house, no, our house, grew smaller in the rearview mirror as Ethan drove, his hands gripping the wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. The silence between us was suffocating, thick with things neither of us could say. "Where are we going?" I finally forced out, my voice hoarse. Ethan sighed, eyes fixed on the road. "My place. Unless you have somewhere else." I didn't. I had nowhere. My hands trembled in my lap as reality sank in. I had chosen this. I had chosen him. But now, as I sat beside Ethan in the dim glow of passing streetlights, the truth burned through me like acid. I didn't want this. I wanted Mason. And I had just lost him forever. Days passed in a blur of regret and emptiness. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Mason's face, his heartbreak, his fury, the way his voice cracked when he told me to leave. I had never known pain like this before. I had shattered the one person who had ever truly loved me. But I wasn't ready to let him go. I sat on the edge of Ethan's couch, my hands curled into fists. I had been staying at his place, but I barely spoke to him. I barely ate. Ethan had stopped trying to comfort me after I made it clear, he wasn't who I wanted. I wanted my husband back. Claire had ignored every one of my calls, but I wasn't going to stop. If I had to beg, I would. Mason needed to hear me out. He needed to know how much I regretted everything. On the 5th day, I drove back to our house, his house now. My heart pounded as I pulled into the driveway, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my fingers ached. The lights were on inside. He was home. I hesitated, staring at the front door, the same one he had slammed shut in my face. Would he even open it this time? Swallowing my fear, I stepped out of the car and walked up the porch. My breath trembled as I knocked. Silence. I knocked again. Harder this time. Footsteps. Then the door swung open, and there he was. Mason. He looked tired, worn down. But it was the cold emptiness in his eyes that nearly sent me to my knees. "What do you want, Hannah?" His voice was flat, devoid of the warmth I once knew so well. "I need to talk to you. Please." My voice cracked, and I hated how desperate I sounded. He exhaled sharply, rubbing a hand down his face. "There's nothing left to say. You made your choice." "No," I stepped closer. "I made a mistake. The worst mistake of my life. Mason, please, I love you. I never stopped loving you." His jaw clenched, and for a brief second, something flickered in his eyes, pain, hesitation. But then it was gone. He shook his head. Love isn't enough, Hannah. Not after what you did. Tears welled in my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. Then tell me what is. Tell me how to fix this. I'll do anything. Mason let out a hollow laugh, shaking his head. You can't fix this. You don't just erase a year of lies and betrayal with a few words. I reached for his hand, but he pulled away like my touch burned him. My heart shattered all over again. Go home, Hannah, he said, his voice quiet but firm. Whatever home you have left. And with that, he shut the door. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, my body numb, my mind screaming. But I wasn't giving up. Not yet. Mason thought this was over. But I would prove to him that it wasn't. The weeks that followed were the hardest of my life. I refused to accept that Mason and I were truly over. I sent messages he never answered, left voicemails that went unheard. I drove by his house too many times to count, each time hoping, praying for another chance. Claire finally answered one of my calls. Hannah, you have to stop, she said, her voice exasperated but tinged with something else, pity. He's not ready. You need to let him go. I can't, I whispered. I need to see him. One last time. Claire sighed. He'll be at the bar tomorrow night. If you want to humiliate yourself again, that's on you. The next night, I arrived at the bar early, my heart pounding. I told myself I would give him space, let him have his night, but when he walked in, looking as perfect as ever, I broke. Mason, I called, stepping toward him. His expression darkened when he saw me. Hannah. What the hell are you doing here? I need to talk to you, I pleaded. His jaw tightened. There's nothing left to say. There is, I insisted. Please, just 5 minutes. That's all I'm asking. Mason exhaled sharply, his fists clenched. Finally, he nodded and gestured toward a quieter corner of the bar. I took a shaky breath. I love you. And I know I don't deserve you, but I need you to know that what I did, choosing Ethan, it was never about not loving you. I was lost, Mason. And I was selfish. And I was wrong. He looked away, shaking his head. You don't get to do this now. You don't get to walk back into my life and say you're sorry like that changes anything. Tears pricked my eyes. I know. But I also know I would spend the rest of my life proving it to you if you gave me the chance. Mason studied me for a long moment, and for the first time in weeks, I saw something familiar in his eyes. Pain. Love. Conflict. But then he spoke, his voice softer, yet firm. Hannah. I can't do this again. My heart shattered. Mason, please. He reached for my hand, and for a moment, I thought he would pull me into his arms. But instead, he squeezed it briefly before letting go. You need to find yourself, Hannah. And I need to heal. And with that, he walked away, leaving me standing alone, drowning in the weight of my own choices. Mason was right. Love wasn't enough. And some things, no matter how much you fight, can never be fixed. I watched him go, knowing this time, it was truly over.